everybody, my name is Laurie Peterson. I'm the Executive Director of Diagnostic Learning Services.
And I'm Abbey Weinstein. I'm the Director of Assessment for Diagnostic Learning Services.
Today we thought we'd spend a little time talking to you about the different types of learning disabilities that you may see in the classroom, what they mean, and really how do you help those students be successful in your classroom once they've come back with a diagnosis. So we're going to walk you through a couple of the most popular, most common learning disabilities, talk to you a little bit about kind of what to look for when we diagnose one, some of the warning signs, and then from there, ways that you can accommodate or help those students in the classroom setting. So we're going to start just by kind of a little bit of an overview. We're going to hit on a couple of the hot ones today. We're going to talk about dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, math learning disabilities, which we now call dyscalculia, and then we're going to touch on just some other reading and writing disabilities that are more commonly seen. So we're going to start off talking about what's dyslexia. So in our PowerPoint, we have a really great video. We're not going to watch that now, but if you have some time later on, there's a great video that talks about, oh, it started my video. How do I get past that screen? There we go. Starting over on that one. So really, dyslexia is characterized, when we talk about dyslexia, when Abbey and I talk to families about what dyslexia is, I have a great definition in the PowerPoint, but really what dyslexia is it's difficulty understanding how the letters and sounds come together to make words. That's probably the easiest way to define dyslexia. Oftentimes, people feel like when they see their child reverse letters or numbers, that's dyslexia, and that is a myth. Dyslexia has absolutely nothing to do with letter reversals. I don't know who started that myth. We'd love to find out who it was, but it has nothing to do with it. Actually, letter and number reversals are really quite age appropriate through about the end of second grade, so that's pretty normal. When we talk about dyslexia, we're really talking about an inability to understand how the sounds come together to make words. So to understand that cat is the word cat, and that's a C, an A, and a T that make those sounds to come together to make that word. And so if you have a student that is having a difficult time reading words in isolation, if they're having difficulty sounding words out, at the early ages, are they struggling to learn the alphabet and assign those sounds to each letter? Those are the things we're looking for. It's going to impact spelling. It's going to impact their overall reading fluency. It's going to impact their ability to recognize sight words. We have lots of people that will say, we tell them a word on this page, we turn the page, and there's that word again, and they come to it, they have no idea what it is. And so it really impacts that word recognition because those sounds and letters just don't make a whole lot of sense to them. So once we diagnose dyslexia in a student, we make some recommendations back to the school. We always want to start with a dyslexia reading program.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important to really understand that a program that's specifically designed for kids with dyslexia, the best way to understand that is that, everybody across the country, we're teaching kids how to read in kindergarten, first and second grade. That's where we're learning to read. But for somebody with dyslexia, you might as well be teaching it in French. Like, it makes no sense to them. If you then provide them with dyslexia therapy through a dyslexia program that's research-based and designed and put together in a way that a dyslexic brain understands, now you're speaking to them in their language.
Right.
Now they're going to learn all those same skills that you would have learned in the classroom. They're just learning it in a way that makes more sense to them. So a dyslexia program is huge, and you can really remediate or fill in some of those gaps that they have with phonics. Some of the more common, did you want to say something?
I was just going to add that those dyslexia intervention programs that Laurie mentioned that are research-based, there are very common ones out there, but they are very explicit and very structured, and they teach phonics in a way that the dyslexic brain understands best and in a very multisensory way. So hearing it, saying it, doing it with large gross motor movements, touching it, feeling the letters, tactile, involving all of the senses. So it's not just reteaching the same way that you taught phonics before, it's teaching it in a very different way, and it's very structured and systematic, and it introduces each letter in a very slow, systematic way, and then they spend a lot of time on each letter, and then learning the reading rules that go with those sounds and why those letters make those sounds. So don't just just think, with an individual with dyslexia that you could just reteach them the same way that you teach all students, but in a one-on-one setting or a little bit slower. They really do need one of those dyslexia therapy programs, ideally provided by a certified dyslexia therapist or a certified academic language therapist.
Yeah, that's true. And interestingly, probably thanks to COVID, there are a lot of those programs that you can work through online with somebody. So if you don't have a therapist that can come to the school or that can go to the child's home, there are some really great programs available online as well. Some of the accommodations that are pretty common that we recommend, and there's a whole laundry list, but some of the real I think some of the most effective ones and some of the most important ones. Mm-hmm. If your classroom is a class that does spelling lists or spelling tests, it's important to modify those words. Ultimately, I think the best way to do that is to take a look at what is happening in their dyslexia therapy, and whatever rule or letter or sound they're working on that week in dyslexia therapy, that should be what their spelling list is based on. It makes the most sense to practice what you're learning. And so if you can tie those things together, it's incredible. If not, just modifying or reducing the list so they have fewer words, or maybe their words are on a lower level, something just to help them find some success with spelling, because spelling can be incredibly frustrating. Mm-hmm. In that same breath, if you have a student in the older elementary grades or middle and high school, not counting off for spelling mistakes. If they're writing and you haven't had a chance to proof it for them, not counting off if they misspell a word, because that's going to happen. Making sure that everything that's written is read to them. So whether that's directions on the worksheet or on the homework, whether that's a test, even a math test that might need to be read to them. But anything that you would automatically assume the kids are going to read independently, it's good to read it orally to a student with dyslexia. And as they get older, their reading skills are going to improve. They may need less and less read to them, but at that point, then you want to check in to make sure, did you understand the directions? Mm-hmm. Did you understand what that said? Do you have any questions about that? Because spelling and writing can be frustrating, allowing them to dictate responses, especially in those younger grades. They may have some really great ideas that they want to share, and you ask them to write it, and you can't read it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense. So allowing them to dictate. You want to know, do they understand what we're talking about? Do they understand the concepts? That's what's most important. The spelling and the writing is going to come. We just have to be patient for that. And in the meantime, we're going to allow them just to dictate their responses. As the students get older and there are more tests being taken, more chapter tests, standardized tests, exams that they have to take, then we want to let them have more time. Even once they've gone through that program, some of those processes and really reading and comprehending can sometimes be a little bit slower for those kids. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that they have plenty of time to finish a test. Usually the standard is 50%, so time and a half, and you can break that up however you like, whatever works best, but just taking the stress off of them to think, okay, I've got to finish this test in 30 minutes. There's no way I can read all this.
Because even if they've learned some great reading strategies and reading rules and they're making progress with their reading, usually the fluency is still lagging. So they're reading a little bit more slowly than their typically developing peers. And so giving them that extra time on the test allows them to read more slowly, to apply the strategies and reading rules they've learned, and not be pressured under a time constraint to read quickly and make a lot of careless mistakes and not recognize a lot of the words they've been taught how to recognize and decode and break down.
One thing we didn't include, though, that might be important to include is that now I feel like we have a lot of students that are taking their tests and exams on a computer. And that doesn't allow them to mark it up at all. And I think in those dyslexia programs, they're learning ways to mark words and to segment words, and they literally mark on the words. So allowing them a paper version of a test it would be huge for them.
Another thing we didn't mention, I just realized it might be important, especially in the younger grades when they're still really struggling with learning to read, is not calling on the student to read aloud in front of class, in front of their peers. So making sure that if you're doing round robin reading or calling on different students, that you identify the ones with dyslexia and don't call on them to read aloud in front of their peers. Wait until they start raising their hand, feeling more confident in their abilities, and then let them read aloud if they so choose to.
A lot of students, too, really benefit from using audiobooks and not always just listening to a book, because sometimes you're not paying attention to what you're listening to. But it's really good for our kids with dyslexia to follow along while they're listening. That way they're reinforcing some of those common sight words. Our language is really interesting in that we have a lot of words that follow those phonetic rules, but we have a lot of words that don't. And those are the words you just have to memorize. And so for kids with dyslexia, that's challenging as well. And so by listening and following along, they're seeing those words. It's being reinforced constantly, some of those common sight words. Their reading vocabulary tends to grow. But it also helps their reading rate because typical audiobooks are read at a pretty average reading rate. So it's kind of training their brain to pace at a pretty average rate. So it does help improve their reading rate. And I always explain to students, look, a chapter in an audiobook is probably going to take you 5-10 minutes tops. So even, practicing at night with some pleasure reading, with a book that might be interesting and a little bit above their level, it helps build their confidence. But again, it introduces some of those sight words that they may not come across in some of the reading they're doing on their level. And then voice-to-text software or text reading software. Again, if a lot of their materials are on the computer, having software that will have the computer read it to them. Also, allowing them to talk and let the computer type. It takes some of the stress out of how to spell this word or getting their thoughts organized. It's more just about letting them talk about what they know, get their kind of purge everything that's in their head, get it onto the paper, then go back and edit and organize their thoughts. So those kinds of accommodations can be really helpful in the classroom. The other really important thing to think about too is that these students are going to be able to get these accommodations all the way through college, graduate school, and so on. And in a lot of those instances, it's important that they're getting them now, especially in those middle and high school years. That extra time, if they're getting it in middle school and high school and they're using it regularly, they can get extra time on the SAT or ACT. But if they're not getting it and using it regularly and they go to take the SAT and run out of time, they won't be able to get it. We have to be able to show they've been receiving that accommodation previously. So it's important to have these things in place, have them documented so that if the student were to ever transfer from your school to another school, there's a paper trail of what they've been receiving. And it's easy. Those are easy things to implement at a new school, but it also helps them then receive them when they move on to a higher level, like graduate school or the MCAT. I mean, who knows, right?
Exactly.
We've had people come back that need this kind of stuff for like the bar exam, or we have medical licensing exams that they need extra time.
Right.
So it's important.
Landscape architect certification.
We've had all kinds of tests, So
all kinds.
Clearly, dyslexia isn't going to limit their ability to do whatever they want, as long as we're supporting them appropriately, giving them the right interventions, and giving them the right classroom support.
And keep in mind, as Laurie mentioned before, dyslexia does not go away, but it manifests differently at different ages. So a child that's very young may struggle with rhyming and identifying the sounds of their letters and starting to blend their letters. And as they get older, they're struggling with reading fluently, comprehending what they're reading. And as it gets more and more rigorous, once they get to high school and college level, they may have learned a lot of reading strategies and skills and compensatory techniques, but it's still laborious for them. So reading is slow. They're applying a lot of those rules and strategies. And so they benefit from that extra time and the continuation of all those accommodations that have been afforded to them, and then can carry those on to post-graduation. If they go to college or a university or a trade school or a technical school, they can get those accommodations as long as there's history that they've been getting them. And of course, current testing that shows they still have a disability that significantly impacts them daily.
So we're going to move on to talk about dysgraphia. So dysgraphia is difficulty with handwriting. And we put some samples in our PowerPoint of a couple of kids. When we talk about dysgraphia, we talk about difficulty with handwriting. They may have really great ideas, and they could tell you a story all day long, but then when they go to write it, nobody can read it, or it's difficult to read. And so when we talk about the different symptoms or characteristics, we talk about the way they form their letters and shape their letters. We talk about the spacing between their words and their letters. We talk about reversing letters and numbers past that second grade level. Remember, letter and number reversals are pretty normal for kids up through the end of second grade. After second grade, it's not dyslexia. Sometimes it can be dysgraphia. They're just not recognizing when they flip those letters around. More frequently, though, I do feel like they transpose letters in a word. Not so much reversed, but they transpose. Their spelling is usually a mess. They sometimes will hold their pencil funny, and they'll have a real awkward grip. They may put a ton of pressure on the paper where you can like see the indentions, and sometimes they don't put hardly any pressure to where it looks like a ghost wrote wrote their paper. They may be very slow at writing. It may take them forever to copy something from the board because they just struggle, and their hand may get very tired. Those are the kids that you see shaking out their hands or rubbing their hands or complaining that their hands hurt. And usually that's due to some fine motor weaknesses, with the muscles in their hands. The way that they hold the pencil can sometimes affect how their hand feels when they write. But, because they struggle so much with the actual process of writing, the content suffers. So you may have a kiddo, again, that can tell you this great story, and then you say, okay, write that down for me, and it's like a 4-word sentence. And you're like, wait, you just had this great story. Well, that's all they can get down. That's all they've got. They'd rather just do that because the rest is too much work for them. And so, again, you're going to see a very low volume of writing output. They're not going to give you what they have when it comes to writing. But really, it's just typically very illegible. And the older the student gets, I think the writing demands increase so much that the legibility really plays into their ability to get their message across. And it can be incredibly frustrating. So obviously, a humongous accommodation, a great way to accommodate this is to let the students type when it's age appropriate. I don't know too many first graders that know how to keyboard.
Right.
They're learning, but letting them type. Anything that needs to be written, let them type it. And if they're not good at typing, that's a great time to start working on some keyboarding skills. I think the earlier the better that they start keyboarding so that they become more confident with their typing skills. Sometimes when they're not ready to type, voice to text is another option. Again, letting them get all of those great ideas out and on paper. Sometimes it's just changing up the material, so letting them use wide-ruled paper, try different pencil grips. What we recommend for math sometimes is to take a lined piece of paper and just turn it sideways. That way, then they've now got columns that they can use to keep their work lined up for those longer calculations. Copies of class notes, reduce the amount of copying that they have to do. Instead of, making them copy the math problems out of the book, make a copy of it for them, let them write on the page. There are a couple of really great apps that we have found that have worked really well for kids with dysgraphia. They were actually developed by individuals who had students that were dysgraphic at home. And so SnapType is an amazing resource that it's done on an iPad, but it allows the student to take a picture of a worksheet, type their answers in, print the worksheet back out. Because typically on those worksheets, they leave these little bitty spaces for kids to put their responses. Kids with dysgraphia can't fit their stuff in there anyway, then you can't read it. So allowing them to type it and then print it back out, easy breezy. ModMath is another great app, but it's for math. It doesn't give them the math answers. It's not a calculator, but it helps them keep their work organized. So for those longer calculations, especially I always think of multiplication like 3-digit by 3-digit where you've got to keep scooching over a column. For kids with dysgraphia, they lose their place. And then breaking those longer writing assignments into smaller, more manageable pieces. They see a big writing assignment, they're like, there's no way I can get all that down. It's going to take me forever. So helping them break it into smaller chunks that they can manage better. And again, helping them with either using a voice to text or typing if they're typing. But maybe giving those students some time in the classroom to do some typing tutorials. There's so many of those great ones.
There are some typing games available online. If you Google typing games, there's something called Dance Mat, which is a great game that teaches kids home row, how to type appropriately. There's many others. That one's been around forever, but I'm sure there's many other. So build their keyboarding skills and know, even for the younger ones that aren't having to write long written assignments or long stories or essays, that still it is a good time to develop those keyboarding skills if they do have dysgraphia, knowing that they're going to be a kiddo that uses technology and takes advantage of that technology. So spend as much time on the keyboard and computer as possible with them.
So we're going to move on to probably one of the more common learning disabilities or types of disabilities that we assess for, and that's ADHD. And so I think probably most importantly, we're going to start out by talking about the fact that ADHD is the term, and there are 3 different types. Probably, I think we figured out somewhere back like in the 1990s, they did away with the ADD.
1994, I believe.
Yes, so it was a while ago. So now we're going to talk about ADHD, which is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and there are 3 main types. You have your students who are primarily hyperactive, which means they're impulsive. They're kind of those kids that look like they're driven by a motor. They're go, 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 go. They can't sit still. They're fidgeting. They're in their chair. They're out of their chair. They're moving around the room. Or they're yelling answers out, always talking to their peers. They're just on the move all the time. But then you have the kids that are the primarily inattentive. And those are your old ADD kids. Those are your daydreamers. Those are the kids that they look like they're listening, but they are a million miles away. And sometimes you don't, as a teacher, even realize that because they look like they're listening. But they're easily distracted. They lose track of time. They lose their belongings. They have a hard time with organization, keeping up with their stuff. But they're not the movers. They're the kids that are, they could sit in their desk all day long. You would never know they weren't paying attention. And then we have the third type, which is a little bit of both. You have a little bit of the hyperactive. You have a little bit of the inattentive, which, is a little bit easier to identify than just the inattentive, but it's not quite the level of hyperactivity for a student who's just the hyperactive impulsive. So it's kind of a healthy mix. I would say that on average, we see all three of these. I wouldn't say there's one that's predominantly more. I think it's much easier to diagnose in boys than it is in girls. A girl who is primarily hyperactive or impulsive tends to be your social butterfly. Chatty Cathy. Is always talking to her friends, whereas the boy is the one who's, moving around, jumping around on the playground all over the stuff. Sometimes, though, it can come out as aggressive behavior, especially with boys. They might get into fights. They might hit or punch or, touch other students. And,
No boundaries.
No boundaries. And a lot of that is just that impulse control. Someone says something, it makes them mad, they punch them. And they know they weren't supposed to. And they immediately are like, oh, I wasn't supposed to do that. But it's that impulse. And so in the classroom, like we kind of listed some of the struggles in the classroom, but, you've got your daydreamers, trouble following directions. You'll give oral directions, and then the student is sitting there staring off into space, not getting started on their assignment. Well, did you not hear? They have no idea what you said to do. They have a hard time switching between activities. If they're working on something and you want them to put it away and move on to something else, those are the kids that you're constantly saying, put that away, come on, we've moved on. And they're still trying to color in their thing or finish an assignment. Sometimes, like I said, they'll yell answers out, talk to friends, have a hard time sitting still. They might be tapping their pencil, shaking their leg, or getting up and moving around the room, or always need to go to the bathroom.
Always wanting to call out the answer.
Yep. Trouble getting organized and staying organized. Their cubby, their desk, wherever they keep their stuff is a disaster. They forget to take stuff home. They forget to bring back stuff from home to school. Their backpack is a disaster. They can't find anything. Longer projects, as kids get older and they have more and more of those longer projects, they can't organize them. They don't know how to plan for them. They tend to procrastinate and save everything till the very last minute, the last night before. And they struggle to remember stuff from day to day. That's probably the biggest complaint I think we hear from teachers is like, we just went over this yesterday and then we come in today and it's like they'd never seen it before. Well, yeah, they were there, but they weren't really there. And so they're not really getting the instruction. So these kids tend to have a ton of academic gaps, mostly in math. Math is so cyclical, it keeps building on itself. And so when they have those gaps at those lower foundational levels, it makes growing on that foundation very hard. So math tends to be one of the subjects we find that kids with attention deficit struggle with the most. So how do you help these kids in your classroom? What are some things that you can do? I think, generally speaking, structure, especially for those younger kids, is absolutely imperative. They need to know what the expectations are. They need to know when, why, how it needs to be done, using timers, helping them understand. If you tell a student with ADHD, you have 10 minutes to work on this, they have absolutely no idea what that means. That could mean it's doing 30 seconds. It could mean an hour. They can't conceptualize that. So using a timer for kids, especially again at the younger ages, can be incredibly helpful. And I will tell you the biggest thing that we share with teachers is that with kids with ADHD, positive reinforcement will get you so much further than any kind of punishment. If you positively reward a student for doing what you've asked, like, Johnny, I love the way you're working. I love the way you got started on your assignment today. I love the way that you finished, got everything done in time today. That is going to go so much further than punishing them. And, whether that's making them stand for recess or even just making them take homework home or calling them out in class, that they don't respond well to that.
No, they don't.
Really, because so much of what they're doing, they're not doing it on purpose.
Exactly. And then when you are calling their name out, and whether it be for negative or positive, it's going to increase the likelihood of those behaviors occurring more and more because it's getting attention. So even if it's negative attention, little Johnny is hearing you call his name. You're giving him undivided attention. You're taking your attention away from other students and giving it to him. So even if it is negative, that is attention for him, and that's feeding Johnny's behaviors, and it's going to increase the likelihood of those behaviors occurring again because he's going to think, well, I got attention doing this, so maybe if I do it again, I'll get attention, whether it be from my teacher or my peers. So rewarding the positive, those desired behaviors you really want to see are crucial because a lot of these ADHD kiddos are hearing their names called out all day long, and they're feeling defeated, and they're feeling like I'm a bad child, and I'm stupid, and I'm dumb, and I just can't do anything right. So the more you praise those positive behaviors with very specific praise, it's going to increase the chances that you're going to see more and more of those positive behaviors from them in the classroom.
And a lot of times we talk about doing a behavior plan of sorts, like picking the 2 or 3, make it manageable, 2 or 3 behaviors that you really want to see this child improve or do more of, and writing those down. And every time you see him, he gets a star or a check or something. So he has a visual too, or she, of those behaviors and how many times he's been able to manage that in a day. And it does help build their self-esteem. It starts taking away some of that negative stigma and the constantly being called on. It's also good too, when you do see something, them start to kind of drift off task, instead of calling their name, just going by and, touching them on the shoulder or putting your hand on their desk, a nonverbal way to communicate. That way, they're not thinking the whole class just heard this teacher yell at me or call my name. It can be very subtle. It doesn't have to be something they'll know. And that could be something you and the student discuss privately outside of class time and say, if I come by and I put my hand on your desk, that's me telling you I need you to get back to task, that you've drifted off. I need you to get back to work. And that kind of can be y'all's, secret language. They kind of like that. Makes them feel special. Allowing them to take breaks. Sometimes after you've been teaching a lesson, that student is sat for 10, 15, 20 minutes. That's a really long time for those kids, especially the younger kids. So allowing them to go run to get a bathroom, get a drink, go to the bathroom. Sometimes even just writing on the note, Johnny needed a break, fold it up and say, Johnny, I need you to take this to the office for me. And letting him run down to the office and come back. But allowing that time to get up and move around. When they come back to class and they're more likely to get started on their assignment and get more done, be a little bit more productive than if you had just jumped right in straight off the instruction. Always checking to ensure that they are on task and understand what they're doing. So they may look like they're working on something, and when you walk by, they're actually just doodling. Do they understand the directions? Do they understand what they need to be doing? Do they need some reteaching of any kind? A quiet place to take their tests, away from distractions, away from watching other kids turn their stuff in, or from trying to be the first one to turn it in. Noise-canceling headphones can be incredibly helpful for students. It really does sort of give them a safe, quiet space where they're still with their peers. And if they don't mind wearing them and you don't mind them letting them wear them, it can be really helpful for them just to, again, drown out some of the noise from the classroom. Again, that extra time on tests. Some kids with ADHD, they have to read something 10 times before they can really digest it. So especially as the kids get older, the reading demands increase, the tests have more reading. Allowing them that extra time can be huge. And then help them organize their stuff. Help them find that system that works for them. You may have a class of students that love their planner and you guys all use a planner, and your ADHD kid or kids, the planner is lost. So we need to come up with a plan B or C or D on how to get these students organized. So work with them, figure out let's talk about your backpack. Let's talk about your locker or your desk or whatever they used, wherever they keep their stuff. And really kind of pull from them what would work best. The more you let them participate in some of these strategies and really tell you how they feel and what they think will work, the more likely they will actually follow through with it, right? You got to get their buy-in.
Their buy-in. And I think also with the organizational system, I think they're going to buy into it if they've had a say-so in it. So maybe choosing a special binder that has folders to organize for each subject, and then knowing that as a teacher, you might have to help them and say, one day a week, each week, we're going to organize your binder and we're going to clean out your desk. We're going to see what needs to be turned into class, what needs to be taken home, what needs to go into recycle bin, and then that's going to help them set up an organizational system that's going to take them into the future and help them be more independent in those future grades. But I like what Laurie said with the buy-in. Let them be, have a say-so in what their organizational system is. Have their parent let them choose a binder or trapper keeper that actually has folders for each subject, or make it color coded. But even having organizational bins in their cubbies and Ziploc bags within their backpacks to put certain things in, so that you can try to teach them ways to help organize. But know that as a teacher, it might really benefit you and the students with ADHD to say, and for all students, in fact, one day a week, the middle of the week or the end of the week, we're going to go through and everyone's going to clean out their desk and organize their backpacks and organize their folders.
We're cleaning house.
It's a great life skill.
Well, and I think, too, for some of those younger students, sometimes doing that in the morning when they get there and in the afternoon when they get home can also be, or before they leave school, can be really helpful, too. Like, okay, do you have everything you need to go home? And when they get there in the morning, do you have everything? Let me go ahead and have those assignments now.
Turn them in
before
now.
you lose them. I'll take them now from you. And just, again, that check-in, check-out thing for them can be really powerful.
Absolutely.
So these kids want to do well. They really do. They want to be successful. They're not lazy. They're not doing any of this on purpose. They so badly want to be successful. They don't know how. And you're with them all day, every day. You can be an incredible resource for them. You can really help build up that self-esteem and help them, find those ways that they can be successful. Because that's all that they really want, and that's all we want. Everyone wants for them.
Actually, and with the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I think it's important to know that it's not necessarily always a deficit in attention. It's more difficulty regulating that attention. So you may see little Susie can pay attention if she's allowed to doodle for 30 minutes straight or play a video game. She can focus for 30 minutes or for an hour. But she has difficulty regulating that attention. So when things are not interesting to her or not meaningful to her, she has a much more difficult time sustaining that attention. So finding ways to make things interesting and more meaningful to ADHD students is going to grab their attention and help engage that attention better, more successfully, and for longer periods of time.
Hang on, we're having a technical.
Okay.
All right, so I think we would like to switch. Do you want to go ahead? Actually, hang on. I'm going to let Abby take this one since we'll just let you go to dyscalculia.
Okay. So dyscalculia, or dyscalculia,
We
some
say it
people
lots of
call
different ways.
is a specific learning disability in math calculations specifically, and it causes difficulties with memorizing math facts, with memorizing the steps and the processes involved in
Completing a problem.
completing problems, knowing how to complete the steps of multi-step problems. It also can cause difficulty with visual spatial relationships, definitely causing difficulties in geometry, being able to tell time on an analog clock, having high levels of math anxiety. I'm looking at the wrong. There's a red one.
It's on the screen.
High levels of math anxiety. Dyscalculia is not a student that is dumb and never learned math. It's a student that's had proper, appropriate instruction and even a lot of practice with learning their math facts. They never learn how to memorize those math facts and get to that automaticity. It commonly co-occurs with other learning disabilities. So it's not related to dyslexia, even though it starts with that DYS, that dys. In fact, the only thing that dyslexia and dyscalculia have in common is that Latin root dys, which means difficulty with. So dyslexia meaning difficulty with language and with reading and writing. Dyscalculia is difficulty with calculations and with math. It can also cause lots of difficulties with math problem solving and understanding math concepts. A lot of math concepts are very abstract, like place value, decimals, percentages, and individuals with dyscalculia have a hard time understanding those very abstract concepts, and they need to be taught in a more concrete, driven, specific, explicit way about those different concepts.
Interestingly, I do think the other thing that it does have in common with dyslexia is they do really benefit from that multisensory, having concrete manipulatives, and being able to talk it out and have it taught to them, watch a video about it. So that they do really benefit from having that multisensory instruction as well.
That's true.
And really all these kids do, same with ADHD. Some of the other, difficulties that we see with dyscalculia, however you want to say it, like we talked about, place value, carrying and borrowing, negative and positive numbers, understanding and doing word problems, most often because the vocabulary is confusing. Yeah, they struggle with what does that word mean, and oftentimes with word problems, you got to kind of read between the lines. Like, what is it asking? It's not just saying. It's not telling me to subtract, it's saying it in another way. So how do I figure out what it's telling me or what it's asking me to do?
And which of the information is not necessary to solving the problem, and honing in on which of the information is what I need to actually solve the problem. They have a very hard time figuring out which concepts, which of the verbiage in those word problems is what they need to hone in on in order to solve the problem.
And I think when we talked about facts, it's not just memorizing your facts, it's seeing the patterns in the facts. They really struggle to see those patterns, and so the multiplication chart doesn't make a whole lot of sense to them. And so you can give that to them, you can make them draw it out. It's probably not going to, they're going to struggle, right? Also putting language to math processes, so not just the lingo in a math problem, but then trying to explain how I solve this math problem, and being able to talk somebody through a math problem or a calculations. And then time, whether it's hours in a day, weeks in a year, months in a year, the seasons, a quarter of a year, all of that is very abstract to these students. Yeah.
Even directions are difficult for individuals with dyscalculia. Learning directions like north, south, east, west, or take a right here, take a left.
They struggle with that.
They struggle with that, with reading maps, interpreting graphs, interpreting calendars, any type of directional sequencing, even learning the steps to a dance routine is difficult, can be difficult for individuals with dyscalculia.
So in the classroom setting, back to the multisensory, we definitely feel like, manipulatives, visual aids, number lines, giving them a list of formulas if it's a high school student who has a test that needs formulas, kind of reduce the amount of things they have to memorize, but also giving them those hands-on tools. Really reteaching the vocabulary. I think, especially as kids get older, we stop teaching a lot of the math vocabulary. It's assumed that they understand it. So we want to make sure that they are really understanding the vocabulary. We're going to reteach it before every lesson if we have to, and just review it.
Even highlight it within those word
yeah, that's
problems.
a great idea.
If you need to help emphasize those math concepts and words that tell them which operation they need to solve the problem, the teacher can go through and highlight it in word problems and help them learn that vocabulary, what that means when you see the word difference or altogether or
how many more. For older students, when you're working a really long algebra problem, providing them with a list of the steps needed. You always, you want to get the variable by itself. So the first thing you're going to do is subtract the number without the variable from each side, or add it, or do the opposite, whatever. List of steps. So they have a sequential list to follow so they can complete each problem independently. It's okay to let them use a calculator. It is okay to let them use a calculator before they get to high school. Most high school kids now, I think, are using a calculator
starting in
all the
ninth
time
grade.
anyway. But it's okay in middle school if you give them a calculator. It's not gonna break their brain.
And I always say to parents, a lot of parents feel like they would be giving their child a crutch by giving them the calculator. But actually, when you are at those higher level math stages where everything is multi-step problems and processes, if you give them the calculator and it frees up their mental energy, they can do the simple calculations on the calculator, and then it really frees up the mental energy and the processing to think about the steps needed to get through that problem and the different processes involved. And they still have to show their work. So they have to do each step and each process within those multi-step problems.
And you're less likely to have those careless calculation mistakes.
calculation.
But not just in math too, but in science.
Yep.
And a lot of those upper level sciences have a lot of calculations in them, especially chemistry.
Right.
So making sure that they're allowed to use a calculator for those calculations as well. And it is okay to have them create the multiplication chart. It helps reinforce some of those skills, and then letting them use it on assignments, especially in some of those lower grades like your upper elementary where you've already covered multiplication, you assume they should know it, now we're moving on. Let them create a multiplication chart each week that they can use for their assignments or their homework. And then really just try to teach using very concrete language, which again I think just goes back to including any kind of manipulatives. I love introducing videos that teach concepts in a different way that maybe you had taught it in class, just something that might give a different spin on it that might kind of speak to that student, because that's what we're trying to get to, right? We're trying to figure out what's going to make them understand this.
Right.
So
maybe explain it in several different ways and differentiate your language and your instruction with that concept you're teaching. They
sure.
can learn, they can make progress.
it's just going to take using some different methods. So we've kind of covered the big four, right?
The most common.
We do sometimes see students that really struggle with just reading comprehension, right? They read beautifully, but they finish reading and they have absolutely no idea what they've read. And they look at you like, I've read all that. I've read every word. I'm going to have to read it again. And usually they just get so beat down by that process that they just quit and skip the questions, or they try to skim it. They go to the questions first. So kids can really struggle with reading comprehension. Usually that's due to some other kind of issue, whether that be like an attention deficit. It could be a language disorder where the student just struggles to understand the language, so they have a hard time putting the message together. So when we have a student where the initial concern is a reading comprehension issue, we try to get to the bottom of why that is. Same for written expression. They may have really great ideas. They have a hard time organizing their thoughts. Now, sometimes we'll see that also in how they speak to somebody. Do they oftentimes lose their place, can't find words, or say things like, oh, forget it, I can't think of what I wanted to say, or I can't think of the word I needed. Those are kids that have a hard time with that expressive language piece, and that's going to show up in their writing as well. So you know that they understand a concept, they go to write it, and you're like, what happened? Like, you totally had this. They just have a hard time putting their thoughts into words, and that's, that there is a written language a learning disability. It's not dysgraphia, because it's not about the handwriting. It literally is about the message and what they're writing.
Expression.
So the one thing that we probably see as common as ADHD and dyslexia is visual processing disorders. And that's something that a lot of teachers and schools aren't as familiar with, but they're incredibly common, and they look so much like dyslexia, dysgraphia, and even sometimes ADHD. And that's really just difficulty with how the eyes and brain are working together, how the eyes are working together as they track across the page. So these kids can be very poor spellers, because spelling is a very visual task. You look at a word and say, oh, that doesn't look right. So these kids are not recognizing when they've transposed letters in a word or jumbled up the letters in a word, or they tend to spell very phonetically. That's how we know they're not dyslexic, right? Because dyslexia is all about the phonics. So if they're spelling very phonetically, they understand the rules. They don't have any idea what this word looks like, so they're just going by how it sounds. Their words will sometimes float up off the lines, or they leave crazy spaces or no spaces. In between their words when they write. They're very choppy readers. They skip words, misplace words. They sometimes need to use their finger as they read, or they lose their place.
They lose their place, or they're skip down to the bottom line or back up to the top, next line.
Read the same line over again.
Read the same line over again.
Sometimes they'll say they have a headache. Reading gives them a headache.
Or they frequently rub their eyes and feel eye fatigue after looking at a lot of visual information.
And oftentimes parents will suspect there's something going on visually, so they'll take their student to an optometrist and they'll have their eyes checked and they'll be fine. And it's very frustrating because not every optometrist will look at some of these more in-depth visual processing issues. And so when we work with families, we have some optometrists across the state that do an excellent job of really digging in. And the great thing about visual processing disorders is they can be fixed. I mean, they're easy to remediate. So if you have a student in your classroom who's struggling with, they take forever to copy things from the board, or everything is, they copy it, but it's a hot mess because they put things in the wrong place. They're very disfluent readers and they tend to spell very phonetically. This may be something to look into.
Right. Or they have very good word attack skills, they have good phonics skills, but when they're reading, it is disfluent. They drop endings on words, they insert words, they omit little words, they lose their place and read the same thing over again. Even if you see letter reversals beyond second grade when it's developmentally appropriate, letter reversals, number reversals, if the child complains of the words moving on the page,
We've had that.
or we've heard them say that they float around, the words float or moving around, or if they read something backwards, that very well could be a visual processing deficit. And there are optometrists out there that specialize in learning-related vision issues, like Laurie said, and they can fix the problem pretty easily through usually a combination of vision therapy exercises and a specific type of lens. Oftentimes they'll prescribe a prism lens to go in glasses, which can help with visual perceptual skills and visual processing. But keep in mind that reversing letters is not dyslexia. Seeing things backwards, reading left to right, writing left to right is not dyslexia. So it could be an indicator of a visual processing deficit. So that is something that we are trained to evaluate, and we can look at and give recommendations to parents to those optometrists in the state that specialize in vision therapy and visual processing deficits.
So I think the last thing that we want to talk about today is determining if a student has a learning disability or is it a second language or a language acquisition issue. And so we have seen quite a few of these over the years where we have students that speak another language at home, and then they come to school and they're struggling with reading, or they're struggling to learn concepts and retain concepts. And so there has to be that discussion: is this a learning issue, or is this the fact that their language acquisition is just behind that of their peers, correct? And so when one of the first things that we always ask is, does the student have the same types of issues in their home language that they have in English? So if they're struggling with, spelling or reading in English, if they speak Spanish at home and they've learned to read in Spanish, are they having some of the same difficulties? If so, then it probably is a learning disability. But if not, if they're able to read or to speak or to spell in their native language, but they struggle in English, then it's probably more of just a language acquisition.
That's right.
And we find that if students, are developing their language and everyone at home is speaking one language, they come to school to speak another language, it's confusing, and it's going to take them a little bit longer to develop some of those skills. And so I think it's really important to think about that when you have a student that does speak another language.
It is. It takes a while, even if you feel like the student can converse very easily socially, that social language develops quickly. When students are fully immersed, they're not native English speakers, but they come to school, they're fully immersed in the classroom, they pick up on the social language very quickly, within a year to 2 years, that social language. But the academic language, or that cognitive academic language proficiency, learning all that academic vocabulary, learning the reading rules within our English reading system, or the non-rules, because there's so many different ways to read in our language, those research says that those skills typically take about 3 to 5 years. So keep that in mind. If a student has only been in the United States for a year to 2 years, or has only been learning English for 2 years, many of their difficulties could be related to language acquisition rather than a specific learning disability.
So that is important as you're looking to refer students for testing, to really have that conversation. And that's something we always try to ask. We can test them only in English. We don't do a bilingual evaluation. You can get a bilingual evaluation through your local school district. And what that basically entails is a full evaluation in their home language or their native language, and then a full language in English to see if the skills are, adequate in both, if their deficit in reading is in both or just in one. And they can determine if it is that. But sometimes just through question and answer and talking to the parents and talking about prior struggles or lack of prior struggles, we can sometimes determine without having to go through a full bilingual evaluation if that probably is what the issue is. So
Right.
It's just something important to keep in mind if you have a student that's bilingual.
Definitely.
So hopefully this has been really helpful. Hopefully you guys have some good strategies in the classroom for students with different types of learning disabilities and struggles. If you guys have questions for us, if you have a student that you're specific, this one student that we didn't touch on, or there's an issue that's come up, you can always email us. We're very happy to help or answer your questions or give you some suggestions of what we would try, to help the student be successful. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.